I learned to play chess from my grandfather when I was 8. And then when I joined the fraternity, I continued to play in chess tournaments to the point where I was actually, in 1960, I think it was, I was 25th ranked in the country as a chess player. It took a long while, but I finally realized that mathematics was a better game than chess. The Battelle Institute in Seattle in 1962 had a conference, and Lashoff had edited a problem list. And Milnor had contributed what he called that were the 7 most important problems in geometric topology. And one of the problems was the Annulus Conjecture, which I could understand. I like solving problems, I guess, and so I could chew on this problem. After about a year or so of graduate study, I had an idea which, with an extra hypothesis, would prove the Annulus Conjecture. Namely, between those two spheres there had to be a little tube that sort of fit together right, and you put the tube into the ball and you got the annulus. So it's fairly simple. And I showed that to Eldon Dyer, and he kind of liked that. He was editor of the proceedings of the AMS, and anyway, he accepted the paper.
How about telling us about the Torus Trick, how you solved all these problems in topological manifolds and where it went from there?
If you took a homeomorphism of the torus, just the 2 torus even, and you took its universal cover, so you had a homeomorphism of R2 to R2, what did that homeomorphism look like? That's for some reason that crossed my mind. And so I said, well, I realized it's going to be periodic. That whatever it did on one fundamental domain is going to do in all the rest. And then I realized, well, if you fix the lattice points, if there's a fixed point, or if this was homotopic to the identity, then the homeomorphism was bounded. And so that was an aha moment. We don't talk about luck much in mathematics. Who wants to believe that their stuff is due to luck? I got to put in the last piece of the puzzle. If I did this work earlier, I would have put in the next to the last piece of the puzzle, so to speak. And somebody else would have come along and worked it out, got all the glory. That strikes me as a good argument for luck, because I certainly could have done it earlier, and then the payoff wouldn't have been nearly as great.
So you were just the right amount smart.
Just the right amount smart, just right.
So Rob, we all know about your work in topological manifolds, but it's been conjectured that you also have a childhood, is that right? And if so, can you tell us about it?
So I like to start the story with my ancestors. So my middle name is Cromwell, and that's from Oliver Cromwell. So back around 1645 or so, there was a man named Percy who fought for Cromwell and was rewarded with land. And they became a well-known family in England. And so for the next 8 generations, the oldest son died in battle, fighting either for or against the king. And 8 generations brings you to the early 1800s when Percy's daughter, the sons didn't last so long, Percy's daughter married a Hackshaw, and a Hackshaw daughter married a Kirby. And those were my great-grandparents. And they immigrated to Nebraska around 1865-70. And that's one of my grandfather, whose name is Cromwell Percy Kirby, was born in 1873. And it was interesting that family, this was a sort of a well-off English family where a girl grew up like a Jane Austen character and learned the fine arts, and all of a sudden she finds herself in a sod house in a hillside in Nebraska with, the closest store was a one day's wagon ride, and she bore 9 children out there, probably all by herself, and 2 of them died. One little girl fell down the family well, and they didn't catch her in time. The other one died of some disease, but 7 survived to ripe old ages. So one of them was my grandfather on my father's side, and he became a Baptist minister. And there was a bunch of Baptist ministers, medical missionaries. Some went to India among my uncles, great-uncles, I guess. And so that was the family. And then my father was born in Indianapolis, 1907, and he expected to become a Baptist minister as well. Went to Denison College and took 4 years of Greek and 4 years of Latin, which is what they did. But somewhere along the way, he decided that that wasn't the way for him, and he was going to save the world through social action, such things. He was a pacifist. He was, well, things of that sort. So he met my mother at Denison. She was the daughter of her parents came from France and Germany, and her father was Abraham Robion, which is where there was no sons in the family, so that's where I got my first name. And they met in Denison and married in 1930, and then they lived in Chicago. Took a few graduate courses in Chicago School of Social Work, which is why I ended up at Chicago years later. And after a while, they both had jobs with the welfare during the Depression with the county welfare organization in Chicago. And at a certain point, one of them was forced to resign because you couldn't give 2 jobs to the same family, especially with no children, because jobs were scarce. So my dad was the one who resigned from that. My mother was probably better at the job anyway than he was. So he took up organizing for the CIO and had a variety of jobs. So, he'd organize for a while. They'd discover he was organizing and fire him. Then they'd get him a job somewhere else, and the same pattern happened. So he did that for a while, and then so then I was born in 1938. So a year or two passed, and then my dad figured that opportunities were better in the West, so we went to Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and he worked for he sort of covered the northern half of the state in some kind of a social work job, welfare job for the state of Idaho. And so we lived there a couple of years. That's where I sort of began my Western upbringing, because I think of myself as a child of the small towns in Idaho and Washington. So we lived there, and then we went to Walla Walla, where Dad had a job with the county. Again, that was a job, see, that's 1942 when we went there, so that's a job that had a deferment. So he was a conscientious objector. But nonetheless, he was quite eligible for the draft, even though he had, well, shortly 2 children, and it was a sole support, and he was on the order of 35 years old, but still being threatened with a draft. And he didn't want to go to jail as a conscientious objector, so he needed jobs with draft deferments. So that was in Walla Walla, and he was not he wasn't out in the streets as a conscientious objector. He was a quiet one. But somebody found out, and the county commissioners told him sadly that they'd like to keep him, but they couldn't do so in this situation, so he lost that job. We went to Yakima for 2 months, lived in some tiny place, and then he got a job with the War Housing Authority or something with a deferment in Spokane, so we lived in Spokane until the war ended. So then, just after the war, the Farragut Naval Base was on Pend Oreille Lake in northern Idaho. It was a big lake, and that's a big naval base where they trained a lot of sailors. And anyway, they promptly decommissioned it, so somebody had the idea of starting up the Farragut College of Technical, I forget the name, it was a college. And so in about Thanksgiving, he was heard of a job there and was offered a job, so he arrives in Farragut at this college and never taught before, and he arrives in the middle of the semester to pick up 4 courses in humanities and social sciences. And then in the move, my mother worked hard, maybe it was fatigue, whatever, she got sick. It turned out she had polio, and so she was almost immediately in the hospital for a month. My brother by then was 3 years old, and so there was my dad starting this. I mean, I'm often struck by this. He was a very calm man who could deal with things, and there he was with 4 courses, hadn't taught before, 4 courses to step into the middle of, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old to look after, and his wife with an unknown disease. It took them a while before they believed it was really polio. And so she came back, I remember, she came back on Christmas Eve. And we'd been too busy, so we had to have a Christmas tree when she came back. So my dad and I were out in the dark, cutting a little candlestick pine, which we brought back for a Christmas tree. So then we lived there for not quite 2 academic years, because he started in the middle. And he liked the job. I thought he'd like teaching, so he decided he'd go back to get a PhD. So we moved to the University of Washington, where he became a graduate student in sociology, criminology in particular. So then I spent 6 years in this town of Edmond, north of Seattle, kind of a rural town. We lived in a dirt road in a little house, and he got his degree, and at the same time I finished high school. So one thing I'd like to mention about my dad was that he was an admirable man, and he wasn't famous or anything like that, but he always knew how to get work. He had an amazing collection of part-time jobs. He moonlighted a lot with jobs. So early on he worked in a steel foundry in Indianapolis when he was supporting his parents, because his dad didn't have a ministry when my father was about 18, so he took a year off before his college. And steel foundry, he worked in a saxophone factory, and later years he drove cabs, he collected bills, he butchered rabbits. We were in Coeur d'Alene. He would go over and work 2 or 3 weeks during harvesting season and drive a combine in the wheat country in eastern Washington. He could always get jobs, and even during the Depression and those times. So he finally got his PhD and got a job at San Diego State University, and that's where they stayed from then on. My mother was a great mother, especially for small kids, and so she didn't have my brother till I was in school because she didn't want to have to divide her time between 2 children. Anyway, that's what she said. I knew all my addition and multiplication tables long before I went to school. I knew how to read because of her. And so then she got me into first grade when I was 5 and a half. And that was questionable back then. I had to take some test, and she had to talk him into it. And so after I'd been in school for about 3 weeks, a teacher contacted my mother and said, "This isn't working. He's not paying any attention. He's never involved in the class." But after a few more questions, Mom convinced him that was because I was bored to death, because I knew everything they were talking about. And so then the teacher would give me extra work, and so then it worked out. Already I was starting the pattern of not listening to teachers, not paying attention in class, not learning by listening to other people. And that you'll see that pattern continued for a long time. But when we were in Farragut, it was a 3-room schoolhouse. And first, second, and third, I was in 4th grade. Sorry, first and second. Then there was 3, 4, 5. I was in 4th grade and listened to the 5th graders, so I wasn't so bored. And so I skipped 5th grade. So I finished high school when I was 16. That was a valedictorian, but it was a small school, 154 graduating class students, I think. And that didn't mean that much. School didn't offer calculus, so I didn't have calculus in high school. And there was nothing very special about my K through 12, except that I didn't have any teachers that were inspiring. They were nice people, but that wasn't, there was nothing very inspiring about any of that. When I was in 8th grade, I was allowed to read in class a lot. And so when I was in 8th grade, the story is that my teacher, Mrs. Sperling, noticed me deeply absorbed in the book and said to the class, "Let's talk about Robion and see if he notices." Well, I didn't notice, and so she gave up. But that's kind of, I kind of think that's how a good description of how my K through 12 was. So then, when I finished, I wanted to go to a school where I didn't have to write essays, because I didn't like to write. My mother always wanted me to put more emotion into my essays, so I didn't want to do that. And so I didn't like essays. So I applied to Reed, Caltech, and Chicago. And the only reason I knew of Chicago, they didn't have a football team after all, was because my parents had taken a few courses there. I was born in Chicago, that's another reason. So I wanted to go to Caltech. So I got into all three, but only Chicago gave me a fellowship. $1,200 it was. And so I went to Chicago. Tuition there was $690 a year, and it remained $690 throughout my stay there. So it's just remarkable compared to tuitions these days. So I went to Chicago, and it was an eye-opener. I'd always sort of lived, there had never been kids around me, and so I was always short of playmates or people I had a really good friend in high school, but he was 1.5 miles away. And so anyway, I get to Chicago, and here's this whole dormitory full of boys to play games with. So it was mostly racket sports, ping pong, racket sports, so those small sports games, and then chess. Played chess quite a bit of my first couple of years. And that was so much fun, I just didn't go to class. Why go to class? I wasn't listening anyway. That was my habit. So I didn't go to class a lot. I went to my math classes more, but I just took notes and wasn't that much involved. And my grades were not wonderful, and they gradually got worse. After 2 years and the fall quarter, I joined a fraternity. So the fraternity was interesting because Robert Maynard Hutchins had banned fraternities in the 30s, but they were still allowed for graduate students. So they became sort of eating houses for graduate students. And then when Hutchins left in '52, I went to Chicago in '54, and they had a new chancellor who relaxed that. So now fraternities were open to undergraduates, but they still mainly consisted of graduate students, Korean War vets, and such people. So the group I joined in my junior year, and some of my friends did. So this was not your typical fraternity at all. They managed to drink just like the regular fraternities, but it was older guys, and it was an interesting place. And it was sort of the jock house, and so we played lots of small sports, and I had a great time doing that. A lot of nights where I watched the sun come up from an all-night poker game. I was still playing chess and so on, and I wasn't doing much in school. So I lost my fellowship at the end of my junior year. At the end of 4 years, I didn't graduate because I didn't pass German. So the Chicago system was you took these year-long courses, so it was a year of German. And at the end of the year, you took an exam. And so it's very difficult. So part of that exam was an oral part. And it's very difficult to pass the oral part if you've never gone to class and have never listened to the German. So I kept passing the written part, but not well enough to pass the whole thing. And so then my graduation was delayed a year. And I'd been working summers and saving money. I was thrifty, and I managed to have enough money. My dad gave me, I think the way he put it was, at the end of, when I lost my fellowship, he gave me $1,000 and said, that should get you through your 4th year, but then that's all you should expect. I think he was an admirable father, but he wasn't inclined to just toss money around. I wasn't working hard at school, so why was he going to give me more money? It was perfectly reasonable. So then, at the end of my 5th year, I somehow did manage to pass German, and that's how I got my bachelor's.
Rob, you were playing poker and chess, more and more chess. How did that go?
So I learned to play chess from my grandfather when I was 8, and somehow I was good at it. And I played a little bit. There was nobody much in high school, but then I arrived at Chicago and went to the chess club my first week or two there, and met some guys and just started playing chess. And particularly one of my best friends was sort of equally good, and we analyzed a lot of games. I think we spent 5 to 10 hours a week. We'd sit down for a session, and a few hours would pass and before we finally quit. And so I did that for 2 years and started going to chess tournaments, and it got better. And then when I joined the fraternity, I didn't play chess near as much and didn't really analyze the game that much after that. But I continued to play in chess tournaments to the point where I was actually, in 1960, I think it was, I was 25th ranked in the country as a chess player. the University of Chicago chess team went to the intercollegiate championships, and they were every 2 years. We went in December 56 and December 58. And there would be 7 matches against another team, against 7 other teams, and you could score. You could either determine the winner of the tournament by who won the most matches or by who won the most games. So that year it was by who won the most matches, and so our team Chicago won, and we would have lost if it had been by the number of games, but we turned out we won by the number of matches. And the Eastern powerhouses, as they thought of themselves, were kind of annoyed at these upstarts from Chicago and figured this was unfair, so they switched it to being determined by games. So no, not retroactively, but for the future. So then we came back in 1958 and won on games, and we would have lost on matches. So we won twice. We had in Sports Illustrated, back when Sports Illustrated thought chess was a game worth covering at the intercollegiate level. But anyway, so I ended up, I never played Bobby Fischer. We just didn't happen to be in the same tournaments. But I played, a number of the best American players.
Was he a contemporary? Close?
Bobby Fischer was 2 or 3 years younger than me. But no, he started early, so he was a contemporary. But I played some of the other people with a record slightly below half, like a record of 8 and 9. Counting draws as half. Well, then when I started to get serious about math, I was thinking, I'm never going to be as good a mathematician as a chess player, because actually chess was easy for me. It took a long while, but I finally realized that mathematics was a better game than chess. It was just a better game. So that's my. So I played poker, but I wasn't a serious poker like one of my future graduate students, William Chen, who won hundreds of thousands playing poker one year in these poker tournaments. So that was a serious poker player, but I wasn't a serious
Wasn't Lasker the world champion, a mathematician?
Yes.
I think that there is some intersection there. And in fact, I remember a quote, and he was an algebraist, and he explained, you just said that chess is a better game, or math is a better game, but Lasker's view is that chess was a better game because he had this deeper competitive urge. And he said, in mathematics, anyone can prove a theorem and argue that it's better than your theorem, but in chess, you just sit them down across the board and beat them.
I see. So saying Lasker reminds me that there's a game I used to play with Kaplansky when I was an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I knew Kaplansky some and McLean some, though I didn't go to class much. But I knew Kaplansky. So there's a game of, it's checkers, except that when you jump a piece, you put the piece you jump under, and you make a stack. And let's say I'm black and I jump several white pieces, and so I've got a black piece on top of 3 white ones. If he jumps me, they take the black one off the top, and then he's got a tower of 3 white ones, which is very powerful because anything that goes over, that captures, is never going to be uncovered because you have to jump it 3 times. So it's a more interesting version of checkers, and Kaplansky used to like that, and we played some. There was no real chess players among the mathematicians at Chicago, except for Ed Formanek. Ed Formanek was a contemporary of mine. He's a professor at Penn State, and he got a higher ranking than I did eventually, not when he's younger than I am. And he was, as far as I know, he's the best combination chess player and mathematician that I know of anyway. I mean, Lasker's different. I don't know how good a mathematician he was, but Formanek's a good Penn State professor and a very good chess player.
So Rob, we talked some about your somewhat dissipative undergraduate career. How did you ever get into graduate school?
Well, I snuck in. That's the short answer. But so I mentioned how I didn't pass German till the 3rd time I tried, and so I didn't get a bachelor's till the end of my 5th year, which was 1959. And so then I had already taken 6 of the 8 courses, graduate courses, that were prerequisites for the master's exam at Chicago. I'd taken those 6, those are quarter courses, so I'd done them during my 5th year. So I wrote to them and said, I'd like to be admitted. I've taken 6 of the 8 already. I'd like to have a chance at the master's exam. And so they wrote back and said, well, all right. They didn't put it that way quite. But they said, we'll admit you provisionally if in your first quarter, the fall quarter of 59, you get grades closer to B than C. So these days that sounds pretty easy. The grading system was harder back in 1959. So I took 3 courses that fall, and one of them wasn't graded. It was one of these sort of seminar courses. The other 2 I got a B and a C. So I wasn't closer. But nobody said anything, so I continued in the winter quarter. And then I took the master's exam in the spring quarter. And so when you took the master's exam, there were 4 possible outcomes. You could pass it and they'd want you to stay on and they'd give you money. You could pass it and they'd encourage you to stay on, but they didn't give you money. Or you could pass it and they recommend you go elsewhere, or you could fail it. So I passed it at the level of recommending I go elsewhere. So that was just a recommendation, and I decided that I'd come back because I don't really remember much about that decision. I just decided I liked Chicago. I was having a good time, so I came back. And so I would have been coming back for the fall of 1960. So I met my first wife in the summer of 1960, and she was an undergraduate at Berkeley. And that led me to decide I'd switch to Berkeley, transfer to Berkeley. So I applied to Berkeley in, fall of 1960, and I didn't do too much at Chicago. It's kind of a lost year. I don't know. I didn't do much of anything. But then I packed up all my stuff, drove to Berkeley to see her, and then inquired about a teaching assistantship, and then I happened to inquire about getting admitted. And to my surprise, I wasn't admitted. And I thought to myself, well, you got a master's from Chicago, that's surely enough to get you into Berkeley, which didn't have the kind of, it wasn't as difficult to get into Berkeley in those days as it is now, but I wasn't. So then I went and talked to Spanier, because Spanier had been at Chicago up until the previous year. I'd never taken a course from him, but I went in to talk to him, and he was no help at all. I was just some guy, and he wasn't gonna, so he didn't do anything. So then I prepared for the PhD qualifying exam in the year 60-61. And the qualifying exam they had was an oral, and you chose 2 topics, and you were examined for 45 minutes on each, I guess. And one of my topics was a chunk of Marshall Hall's theory of groups, finite group theory, theory of groups, whatever it is. And the other one was all but the chapter on cohomotopy theory from Hu's book, H-U, his book on homotopy theory, which is one of the few texts in algebraic topology around. The reason I chose that, I'd taken some courses in topology, but going back a couple of years, I had taken a course probably from Helmos on point set topology. That was one of those 8 graduate courses. And they used Kelly's book. And I thought the problems in Kelly's book were fascinating. There were things I enjoyed chewing on. I could usually get them in an hour or less. But I just liked them. It was my kind of learning. It was sitting down and working, problem solving, and not as opposed to sort of learning through lectures, which I still didn't do really. So that's what got me enough interested in topology to take an algebraic topology course the previous year. And so then my 2 topics were Hu's book and Marshall Hall's book. So, in those days, I didn't hang out with mathematicians. I never talked about mathematics. And so I go into my qualifying exam, and I don't know what happened, but I had no practice at thinking on my feet. And so I didn't pass. And they were nice about it and told me that, you should really come to T and start picking up folklore and picking up stuff and just talking math, getting a hold of the culture. And so that sounded fine. They had good chocolate cake at the T, and so I started going to T, and Steenrod was visiting that year. He's a very nice man, and I remember at T, listening to him describe the Hopf map from the 3-sphere to the 2-sphere. And all I'd seen was just the map where you take two complex variables and map to the projectivization of those two unit complex numbers. And that just didn't mean much to me. And then he describes this as here's the R3 with a point at infinity, and you've got the z-axis is one, and the point at infinity is one circle. You have the unit circle, and the xy plane is another circle, and then you have concentric tori, and you look at the 1-1 curves that go around this torus once this way and once this way. And you fill up the 3-sphere with these circles, and the Hopf map is the quotient map, where every circle divides out to a point. Well, that was one of the great moments of my, up till then, 7 years at Chicago, was hearing that and getting, that's the way I think of things. And so I'd been taking algebraic topology and such courses, and they were okay, but that and Kelly's problems were the first really geometric things that I sort of got into. So then I took the qualifying exam of the same two topics again. They let you take it again. Well, this time they said, you passed. They didn't say it with any enthusiasm, but they said, you passed. You did okay in the group theory, but you didn't do very well in topology, and that's probably not a good thing to go into. That was probably in April. I went in and talked to Saunders McLean, who I'd taken a couple of courses from, and he'd always been nice to me. He had written a letter so that I got a job teaching at Roosevelt University in downtown Chicago, starting in 1960, the year earlier. And that's what supported me throughout graduate school. I remember I taught 9 hours for a couple of years. These were pre-calculus courses. I taught trigonometry and college algebra. Remember the first time I went in there at the age of 22 with a suit on, so that these were older students. It was a night school. They're older students. I wanted to have a little bit of dignity to me. So I went in, I remember going in and wondering how I was going to fill up an hour and 75 minutes with trigonometry. And I managed to get through, say, 2/3 of that and then just stop the class early, but by then I had a better idea. So the next time I managed to fill up the time. And then, and so on. So I sort of learned how to do that. Didn't take much time because after you've taught those courses once, you don't have to prepare too much, especially in those days.
You think has that changed a bit?
Yeah, students expect more. These were older students and end of a long working day, and they were happy to come to class and get out of there and just listen to a lecture. Saunders McLean had helped me. He had written a letter for me to get a job down there. So I went in to talk to him, and he said, "Well, what are you interested in?" So I mentioned homological algebra because it didn't seem that hard, and I'd had courses in it. I mentioned the group theory because of the book, and I mentioned topological manifolds. Now the story there is that a postdoc, a guy, George McCarty, had been a student of Aaron's at UCLA, and he'd written a thesis about the homotopy groups of the space of homeomorphisms of a manifold. It wasn't a very hard thesis. It was easy for me to understand. And he was kind of a little lost there, I think. Nobody was doing that stuff, and he didn't have anybody to talk to. And he'd been on my qualifying exam. So he says to me, why don't you come in and talk about it? Why don't you read my thesis and we'll talk about it? So I read his thesis and kind of liked the stuff. So I mentioned that to McLean. And McLean rather wisely says, well, go home for the summer and think about these subjects and come see what you want to do and come back and talk to me. So I went home, and all I thought about was the topological manifolds. And I didn't think about it very much. But anyway, so I came back, and now we're now in the fall of 62.
So there had already been a major breakthrough in topological manifolds in Maser and Morton Brown. Were you aware of this, the Schoenflies theorem being
I'm
proved?
not sure if I was aware of it right at that moment, but I shortly was. And
but that isn't what intrigued you about topological manifolds,
No.
the fact that the subject had just undergone this transformation.
No, that isn't what got me into it, no. So then I get back in the fall of 62, and I have to find an advisor. Well, Dick Lashoff would have been the natural person, but he'd been on my qualifying exam and had suggested I not write a thesis in topology. So I felt uncomfortable going to him, but Eldon Dyer had been away that year. So I went in and asked him about this and said, this is what I'm sort of interested in. He was a student of R.L. Moore, so he knew some of what I was thinking about, although he had become very algebraic. So I asked him, and I didn't expect him to answer because he didn't really know who I was. So after talking a few minutes, I left, and I don't know, a month later, I had a topology question, and I went in and asked him the question, and he didn't bring up the advisor bit, and I didn't bring it up because I thought the ball was in his court. And that went on a few more times, and at some point it sort of became obvious I was his student. Though we had never, not a formal word had been said after my first request. And he told somebody later on that he realized that at some point or other he was stuck with me. But he wasn't quite sure how it happened. And so one of my main connections with Eldon Dyer was I used to play three-way cutthroat handball with him and John Polking, who then had a long career at Rice. Polking wasn't Dyer's student, but we played handball together. So a lot of my contact with Dyer was simply playing handball with him and maybe a little bit of conversation around that occasion. So in the summer of '63, at the end of the year in which I started work with Dyer, he was away for the summer and asked me to live in his house and look after the house. And so we lived there that summer. And so his library was there. And I think, so the Battelle Institute in Seattle in 1962 had a conference, and Lashoff had edited a problem list. And Milnor had contributed what he called that were the 7 most important problems in geometric topology. And I think I saw that list and was intrigued by it because it was geometric topology. And one of the problems was the Annulus Conjecture, which I could understand. The Annulus Conjecture. Well, first of all, the Schoenflies theorem says if you have a topologically embedded sphere, n-1 sphere, in the n sphere, then did that n-1 sphere bound a ball? Well, not right off because of the Alexander Horn sphere, which is an embedding that doesn't bound a ball on one side. But if you require that this ball have a neighborhood, which is, they call it flat or locally flat. So suppose you embedded the n-1 sphere across an interval. So you had a thick sphere embedded. Then Mazur's big breakthrough in late '59 was to, by this infinite method he has, was to show that that bounded a ball in all dimensions, a topological ball in all dimensions. And then shortly thereafter, Morton, actually he didn't prove the whole thing. He had a little hypothesis that was removed later by Marston Morse. But then Morton Brown gave really a rather different kind of proof that was complete. And they shared the Veblen Prize for this later on. So I understood Mazur's proof. That wasn't so hard to understand. And then Mort Brown wrote a 3-page paper in the Bulletin. And I still have trouble remembering those 3 pages. It's a complicated argument, which is quite subtle, and it's really a nice piece of mathematics. But I sorted through that at some point, but then I could understand, now the Annulus Conjecture is the next step. So the Annulus Conjecture says, suppose you have 2 of these thick n-1 spheres embedded. Is the region in between them a sphere across I? Is it an annulus? And so that was the Annulus Conjecture, and that was one of Milnor's problems. His other 6 were, as every topological manifold have a triangulation, the Hopf-Vermeulen, which is that triangulation unique, the topological invariance of Whitehead torsion, so those 3 in the Annulus Conjecture makes 4. The topological invariance of rational Pontryagin classes, which was solved by Novikov in 1965, and one of the reasons he got a Fields Medal. The double suspension conjecture, which Bob Edwards solved in '74 about, and then the Poincaré conjectures in dimension 3 and 4 were the problems.
Let me just ask, when Milnor compiled this list, did he realize that the Annulus Conjecture was so closely related to the Hopf-Vermeulen, or Did he just think it was a very simple and beautiful question?
I think he thought, I'm guessing, I've asked him, and he often answers, I just don't remember, to questions like that. But I've asked him, and I think it was just because he thought it was the next thing after the Schoenflies theorem, and just a natural question. So the nice thing about this was, especially for the Annulus Conjecture, not all of the others, was that it was elementary statement. You could be somebody like me who didn't really know much mathematics at the time. I could still understand it, and it was a problem. I like solving problems, I guess, and so I could chew on this problem. So that's how I got into it. And after about a year or so of graduate study, I had an idea which, with an extra hypothesis, would prove the Annulus Conjecture with an extra hypothesis. But namely, between those two spheres, there had to be a little tube that sort of fit together right. And then the point was that after you put that tube in, the complement was now, there was a Schoenflies theorem there. The front bound of the ball, and then you put the tube into the ball, and you got the annulus. So it's fairly simple. And I showed that to Eldon Dyer, and he kind of liked that. He said that he was editor of the proceedings of the AMS, Proceedings of the AMS, and he remarked that he was handling a paper of O.G. Harold, which didn't do as much, and so he was kind of pleased, I think, and anyway, he accepted the paper. Later on, I'm pretty sure we found out that this was kind of folklore in the Bing School of Topology, at least amongst somebody probably knew this, because it wasn't that hard. But anyway, that gave me a paper, and it probably made Eldon Dyer think that there was some hope after all for this graduate student he ended up stuck with. And so then he relocated, he accepted a job at Rice University in my last year. And so he got me a fellowship there, and so I went down there. Now, the other important thing about my graduate life was that I met a student, there was a fellow grad student, Walter Daum, D-A-U-M, and he was unlike me. He had caught up with me in 4 years. He'd done in 4 years what I did in 7 or 8. He was a bright fellow, but we started talking, and we ended up running a seminar, just the two of us. We met 1 hour a day, every day of the week, and we read through papers. And one rule was you weren't supposed to prepare. We all came in equally, just started. Somebody would go to the board, write out the theorem, then we'd think, how would we prove this, and what would we do? Maybe get a hint if we couldn't do it, and just work through papers. So we read through Siemens PL topology notes, read through a bunch of Stallings papers on unknotting of topological spheres, read some of Heffliger's stuff on smoothly unknotting spheres, and I had already read the Mort Brown stuff, the Schoenflies stuff. And so this is where I learned a lot of geometric topology, not in classes. Ever since, I've always recommended that method of learning, where you sit down with a contemporary and you, small group, and you read through things together. The social aspects of it kind of keeps you working. And we never drifted off during that hour, because we were, and you work things out for yourself. That's different than listening to a lecture, and that worked for me. So that was easily the most important thing in my education up to that point in my life. I never listened to classes much, to professors, didn't listen to authorities much, but that really worked for me. Then what was interesting about Walter was that he went down to Rice with me also, and he got stuck on a sort of a problem that was a little hard. Decided to leave Rice and finish his thesis, take a job at CCNY and finish his thesis, and he never did, never followed it up in math. So after that great start, he turned to something else. But I finished up a thesis while I was at Rice. It was published in topology. So then my advisor was having a beer with Lowell Page. Lowell Page was chair at UCLA. They were having a beer in Denver at the AMS winter meeting.
What year would this be, roughly?
In 1965, January 65. And he came back and told me I had a job offer at UCLA, and in one way or another he indicated I better accept it because I wasn't getting anything better. So this story of how I continually was on the edge of leaving Chicago, just sneaking in here and there, getting an advisor by some kind of trick, and only finally getting going and discovering that mathematics was really a good game. And so I'm told this story has lasted around Chicago, and every time they have to talk about graduate students and who should we keep and who should we really force to leave, somebody always says, well, it worked out okay that we didn't force Kirby to leave. So, so I think I warped their system ever since then.
Rob, so how about telling us about the Torus Trick, how you solved all these problems in topological manifolds and where it went from there?
I was interested in the Annulus Conjecture and thinking about it as a graduate student, and got one little result for the proceedings of the AMS. Somewhere in there I had some crazy idea and wanted to show Dyer, and McLean was in the hallway and joined us, and the argument, well, there was a mistake. And so then after that, McLean takes me aside sometime or other and says, Rob, the Annulus Conjecture is kind of a hard problem for a thesis problem. And, well, of course it was. I mean, I was thinking about it. It wasn't my thesis. I was thinking about it. But whenever I had an idea, I thought about the Annulus Conjecture. Well, a couple of things were sort of led up to it. One was I'd heard of some work of Ed Cannell, in which he pointed out that if you had a bounded homeomorphism of Rn, bounded means that no point was moved more than a constant, then that was isotopic to the identity. And that was interesting because we didn't really have conditions on a homeomorphism that told you anything, really, unless it was smooth at a point, PL and an open set, but if you didn't have those, you couldn't do anything with a homeomorphism. So it's being bounded was something I recognized. It was an easy fact, but it was I certainly remembered it. And so then I'd been invited to the Georgia Topology Conference in summer of '67, and met some people, and Dennis Sullivan, and that was interesting. And then they invited me again in '68. And in 1968, Chernovsky, there was a preprint of Chernovsky, the Russian. He hadn't gotten out to the West, but there's a preprint in which he proved that the space of homeomorphisms of Rn, or maybe of a manifold, were locally contractible. So a neighborhood of the identity was locally contractible, for example. And so I thought that was interesting. That was stuff I should know about. And I brought a preprint back with me. And I was sitting in my apartment, and my son was asleep. He was about 4 months old then. This was August of '68. And my wife was out somewhere. And I was looking at this preprint, and something made me wonder what if you took a homeomorphism of the torus, just the two torus even, and you took its universal cover, so you had a homeomorphism of R2 to R2, what did that homeomorphism look like? That's for some reason that crossed my mind. And so I said, well, I realized it's going to be periodic. That whatever it did on one fundamental domain is going to do on all the rest. And then I realized, well, if you fix the lattice points, if there's a fixed point, or if this was homotopic to the identity, then the homeomorphism was bounded. And so that was an aha moment. In fact, I would say that having realized that, everything else was downhill from there. Just that one thought. And so the fact that it was bounded meant that it was stable. So the notion of a stable homeomorphism was something else from a few years earlier. Brown and Gluck had written papers in the Annals about stable homeomorphisms. And a homeomorphism was stable, homeomorphism of a manifold was stable if it was a finite composition of homeomorphisms, each of which was the identity on some open set, depending on for that homeomorphism. Well, you could easily then see that the homeomorphisms, the lifts of a torus to Euclidean space, they were stable, but the stability is a local property so that all homeomorphisms of tori, in tori, were stable. And I thought, gee, that's really an interesting fact. I mean, I realized it that evening. And so then the question was, well, I say to myself, that's an interesting fact, but it's just a curiosity if it's only something for tori. So then I began to wonder how you do it for Rn, for example. Proving homeomorphism of Rn were stable was much more interesting. So, that day or maybe the next day I realized that if you immerse a punctured torus, so take the n torus and remove a point, and I knew there was an immersion from immersion theory. Later on, Milnor constructed one, actually constructed it, but I knew the existence proof. That was nice geometric topology. And you immerse the punctured torus, and now suppose you have a homeomorphism which moves it just a little bit. Well, if it moves it just a little bit, then a slightly shrunken version of that immersion would stay inside the larger one. And so therefore, that gives you a homeomorphism from the, think of one torus as having a bigger puncture into the torus with a small puncture. And then you can fill that in with a Schoenflies theorem. Furthermore, you can fill it in a continuous, canonical way. So now suddenly you've gone from a homeomorphism of a small homeomorphism of Rn to a homeomorphism of the torus. Well, then its cover is bounded, and they're both stable, but this is a local property. The homeomorphisms, small homeomorphisms of Rn were stable. But even more so, they were locally contractible because they were bounded, and then you just do the Alexander isotopy, and that gave you the contraction of that homeomorphism to the identity. So at this point, I'd proved then that space of homeomorphisms Rn was locally contractible, which was Chernovsky's theorem. But nonetheless, this is a completely different proof, and so I was naturally excited by that. And this had happened in a day or two or three. But that was only homeomorphisms which are close to the identity. What about just homeomorphisms in general in the Annulus conjecture? Well, so then there was another technique to get from a homeomorphism of Rn to something on the torus. And so that is to again use the same immersion. But now you take the PL structure here and you pull it back by the homeomorphism to get a different PL structure on the torus. And then you fill that in, which I only knew how to do in dimensions other than 4, because it took a little topology to say that PL, you got a punctured torus, so you have a PL structure on the n torus except for an open disk. So there's a PL n-1 sphere there, and you have to show that bounds. You have to show there is a PL n-1 sphere there. That's the coloring theorem of Browder and Siebenmann, and then you fill it in. So you end up with a strange PL structure on the n torus. And so now, if that was PL homomorphic to the standard torus, then in this diagram, you can then use that PL homomorphism and take an infinite cover and make an argument that the original homomorphism was stable. So this reduced the problem to questions about PL structures on an n torus. And so I realized this, and I wrote a letter to Dennis Sullivan. He was in Berkeley, and I met him, and he knew about these sorts of things. He'd already done the Hauptvermutung for manifolds. So I wrote him a letter and didn't hear from him. And when I asked him about it later on, he said he read up to the point where I pulled back PL structures and sort of said to him something like, I didn't like that. I didn't like pulling back structures. Something or other made him stop reading. And so he stopped there and didn't continue any further.
The Torus Trick, to me, is one of the simplest, most beautiful things in mathematics. And I've never been able to understand why it isn't the foundation of n different subjects within mathematics. And I made it a little bit of a project of my own over the last 30 years to try to use the Torus Trick in novel areas and see what would come of it. And with, I'd say, only very modest success. I mean, I wrote a paper once on, it's called Truncation of Wavelet Matrices. I mean, so, it is known that the Torus Trick has an algebraic version, and you can actually, some kind of a subject called controlled linear algebra, where you try to do rather ordinary things in linear algebra like row-reduced matrices, but now you pay attention to how far rows are apart as measured in some metric space, and you only are allowed to add rows that are in some sense close together and not build up too much of a motion in this control space. So the Torus Trick, definitely has something to say about linear algebra. It's a way of proving theorems in controlled linear algebra. And signal processing, is essentially a linear algebraic subject, and so the Torus trick does have some role in wavelets, and there are strange directions. And since I become interested in physics, very often boundary conditions are a key part of the physical discussion. You have a sort of a Hamiltonian template, and you can wrap it up with different kinds of boundary conditions, or you can consider with open boundary conditions. And since the Torus trick is a way of going back and forth between, in physics language, open and periodic boundary conditions, it should be very important in condensed matter physics. I don't know exactly how to justify that statement, but I'd like to. So I think the Torus trick, because it is so simple, is very likely to be important in other areas where we haven't yet discovered.
You could make the philosophical point that nature always uses the most elementary things it can.
The fact that the Torus trick is simple is very good. It bodes well for its use in other directions, and I would encourage mathematicians, to try to apply it.
I had already arranged to spend the fall quarter at the Institute for Advanced Study, which was very fortuitous because I arrived there and I didn't know too many people, but at some point I had a conversation with Siebenmann and Browder on the steps of the Institute of Fold Hall. And I told them something about, I had already figured out how to extend this from just Rn to a k-ball across Rn, so that you were doing this for k handles, not just zero handles. Rn was kind of like a zero handle. So I already knew how to do k handles, and I was explaining that you could triangulate manifolds and do the Hopf-promoting if all handles were straightenable, i.e. they were rail boundary isotopic to a PL handle. And so I said something like this, and that wasn't Browder's subject, I think, but Siebenmann heard me. And anyway, a little while later, I'd probably been at the Institute for 3 or 4 weeks by then, but I found myself at a colloquium dinner seated next to Larry Siebenmann. And so Larry, in his inimitable fashion, starts questioning me about this stuff, the Torus trick and so on. Starts questioning me, and by the time the dinner was over, I felt he'd sucked every bit of knowledge out of my brain. And so he was very interested, and we started collaborating. It was still left that the Annulus conjecture was true if this homotopy, this PL structure on the n-torus was standard. It was not PL isotopic to the standard structure. Well, Terry Wall had done a lot of work in non-simply connected surgery. And so Larry started learning more about that. We were talking to Bill Browder, and I was trying to pick up some of it. And at some point, it became clear there was a Z mod 2 obstruction in the third cohomology related to the Rock-Leans theorem, the 8 versus 16 difference in Rock-Leans theorem. So it was related to that, and there was a Z2 obstruction, and at some point I was talking to Larry, and I was thinking to myself, well, if you took 2 handles and sort of put them end to end, if they're 1 handles, you really do that, but if it's a K handle, it's like taking 2 K balls and meeting them along a K minus 1 ball. So I thought, well, maybe if you double the problem like that, that Z2 obstruction would go away. So I said to Larry something about doubling. And Larry immediately thinks, oh, let's take a double cover of the torus. And it turns out that if you do take a double cover of the n torus, even whether or not you've crossed with the K ball, that this obstruction of walls vanishes. Well, we were going to take an infinite cover anyway in the Torus trick. You always want up to Rn. So if you first take a double cover, now there's the PL homomorphism you want, and then you take an infinite cover. So it was done. So that was an added in proof comment in the Annals paper, in which, of course, Larry was part of that. That was the case of a 3-handle. And philosophically, the point is you've got this obstruction, which has to do with the Rock-Leans invariant. It calls for a 4-manifold, a spin 4-manifold PL manifold of signature 8, which doesn't exist. But in all other cases, that could lie in the fiber, and when you take a double cover, it disappears. But somehow this obstruction could lie in the 3-handle, the B3 cross TN, and the B3 part. And that there's no double cover there, so that was a problem. So then we put together a lot of Larry's knowledge about differential topology and reducing the topological tangent bundle to a PL tangent bundle, and Cairns Hirsch type theorem. You know, if you have a PL structure on a manifold cross R, then you have it on a manifold, and so on. All that stuff. He knew a lot better than I did. He was a perfect collaborator for me, and we ended up triangulating manifolds. So I didn't make it home for Christmas. So I stayed on at the Institute, and we finished an eight-page bulletin article in which we stated the existence of triangulations if the subtraction vanished. The Half-Vermutung was true if the similar obstruction vanished. The topological invariance of Whitehead torsion was now true, and the Annulus conjecture was true. So in a way, this was 3.5 problems out of Milnor's 7. When I say a half, that's because Larry Dennis Sullivan had already done half of the Half-Vermutung. He'd done it for homotopy equivalence. I sometimes felt like the Virgin Mary. You know, how could this happen to me? How could I be this person that received 3.5 of Miller's problems? You know, I was struck that way. At that point, I went back to UCLA where I was, and Larry was still at the Institute. And we were continuing to think, but I must admit, I sort of felt that we'd already taken care of everything except this one little obstruction. We ought to just drive through and get rid of that obstruction. And Larry had a different tact, I think. He said if we got rid of that obstruction, then most of the work he'd done in the fall about all this theory and so on would be unnecessary. So it was very much in his interest to find a counterexample. And perhaps he just genuinely felt there was one anyway. I think he was probably right in thinking that. And then a group of us in spring break in March of '69 were skiing at Heavenly Valley in California. And Larry has bad allergies. And so he was sleeping in the basement where there was no rugs, nothing to make him, that he could be allergic to. And we realized that we weren't seeing him during the day skiing. And about a week later, he wrote me a letter saying that he'd shown that there was a counterexample, that there were 3 handles that could not be isotope to PL handles. And that's what he'd been doing. He was in the final throes of working that out when we were up there skiing. And so I sat down to read his letter, almost in the same seat that I'd been sitting in for the Annulus conjecture. And I was trying to understand it. It was a complicated argument, and suddenly something occurred to me which made the proof almost trivial. Wall had told us that there was a PL structure on the n-torus cross an interval, standard on both boundary components. So there's a PL structure on there, standard on both boundary components. That was not standard. There was no PL homeomorphism. However, and if you showed that there was homeomorphic rel at the 2 boundaries, then you'd have a counterexample, because there'd be a homeomorphism which could not be isotope to a PL homeomorphism because there was none. There's all rel boundary. However, the Escobar-Wordism theorem says that there is a PL homeomorphism from I cross Tn here, which is the same as the given one here, but it's different here. And that's the important point. It's different than the other end. Well, then what I realized was that if you took an odd cover, the obstruction still lives. It's only even covers that kill it. So you take a large odd cover, then this homeomorphism on this end becomes very close to the identity, or very close to the one that's given to you. The difference between them comes very close to the identity. And then I proved local contractibility before, so it was isotopic to the identity, and now we had the homeomorphism. And there was no PL homeomorphism, so there had to be a 3 handle that couldn't be straightened. And so I thought of that right then. And so Larry's long argument, I think I've lost the letter and I don't even know what that argument was. It was the end of the major part of that body of work. They got wind of this at UCLA, and I promptly got an offer from Rutgers doubling my salary, which would have been $11,000, and they doubled it to $22,000. And I didn't particularly want to go live in New Jersey, but you know, it's kind of hard to turn down doubling your salary. And I couldn't imagine that UCLA would do that, but they did. So I went from being an assistant professor to the highest step of full professor. I was sort of famous on campus because practically in any other field, you can't do anything that gets you promoted like that. You know, you could be in the English department and write Shakespeare's best play, but it wouldn't be recognized that fast. It just wouldn't happen that dramatically. So there were people this ad hoc committees had to know about this, and people would say, "What's going on in math? Does this really make sense?" I often say I thank Milnor. If he hadn't done those 7 problems, I might not have gotten into the subject. But every time when this goes to the dean, and the dean says, "Well, what do you mean this guy's good?" Well, they point out Milnor's 7 problems. His imprimatur on his stamp on those 7 problems has probably meant hundreds of thousands of dollars to me in my lifetime. You know, you get a raise and it sticks with you every year after that. It's sort of dramatic. I sometimes talk about luck. You know, we don't talk about luck much in mathematics. You know, who wants to believe that their stuff is due to luck? And you know, in the sports world, people said, you know, people make their own luck. Could have thought of the Torus Trick 3 years earlier, 4 years earlier, with no problem whatsoever. I could have thought of it then. There's nothing in between that one needed to know. Brown and Gluck could have thought of it in 1961. So I could have thought of it earlier, and if I'd been smarter or quicker or something, I would have thought of it earlier, and then Wall would not have finished his non-simply connected surgery. And so then I would have done this really nice piece of work, but the final piece, I got to put in the last piece of the puzzle. If I did this work earlier, I would have put in the next to the last piece of the puzzle, so to speak. And somebody else would have come along and worked it out, got all the glory. That strikes me as a good argument for luck, because I certainly could have done it earlier, and then the payoff wouldn't have been nearly as great.
So you're just the right amount smart.
Just the right amount smart, just right. The first year you were at Berkeley, I heard some lectures of Andrew Cassin's again, and came back and reported on it, and you got quite interested, and so we wrote a paper together. And what, have you forgotten?
Yeah, I'd forgotten that. Well,
this is this paper.
A geometric proof of Rock-Leans?
Geometric proof of Rock-Leans theorem, yeah. So Andrew had given a proof.
Yes.
Rock-Leans theorem is this famous theorem in 4 manifolds, and there was proofs in Russian, and there was no proofs that were accessible to us, our kind of topologists. And so Andrew gave one that was, and then I talked about it, and then we talked about it, and then you wrote the paper that came out of that. It was a nice argument. Like all of my collaborators, you did the writing.
Yeah, but actually I remember you very generously offered that I should collaborate with you on what was your next big achievement, this so-called Kirby calculus. And I thought that wouldn't go anywhere. All these complicated link diagrams. Maybe you should say a word or two about how you got into Kirby calculus. That was 74?
There was a conference in Tokyo in spring of 73, and it was for Kodaira. And a bunch of us were there, and at a party afterwards, you know, I was standing around, and I overheard Takao Matsumoto say something about the Kummer surface to somebody else. And somehow, I knew the Kummer surface was a 4-dimensional manifold. It's a complex surface, a particular complex surface, and what we now call the K3 surface. But anyway, I heard about that, and somehow it intrigued my interest. So I got back to Berkeley. And at Berkeley was a fellow named Arnold Cass, who was a student at Kodaira. He was there as an assistant professor, and the previous year I'd gotten to know him because we ran together. And he was an interesting guy, had a lot of interests, and so we would talk about stuff. But when I came back from Japan, I asked him about the Kummer surface. So he starts to tell me about complex surfaces. And as I listened to him, he was good at explaining things the ways I understood, and I sort of tried to translate it into manifolds and handle slides and stuff like that. And there was just various, what is a blow up? When the algebraic geometers blow up a point, what does that mean? And so I would translate that into connect sum with a CP2 bar, and various things would slide over it and not intersect anymore, and stuff like that. I would translate it into handle body theory. And as this wore on, and I'd do more of this, I realized that often there was a nugget, I mean a piece of a complex surface with a boundary, and then they would do local constructions and the boundary wouldn't change. So at some point I began to sort of realize that there might be a theorem here. I was building these complex surfaces with boundary by adding two handles to a four-ball. These are usually simply connected complex surfaces, so just two handles. And there's various ways to add two handles to the four-ball to get keep the same boundary. And so at some point I began to wonder whether any two ways of getting from one two-handle body picture to another one with the same boundary, I began to wonder whether the moves the algebraic geometers had were enough to get from one to the other. Now, you automatically had to extend them by the anti-holomorphic blow-ups. So there's the other half. So you use that too. I began to think about this, and so, you know, I talked to people. I asked John Morgan a question about things bounding. And anyway, it took a while to evolve. And eventually things got simplified, and I realized what I needed was some surf theory, some one-parameter families of Morse functions, except for singular times when they have births and deaths. And so then I was back in Berkeley after being at IHES. Oh, yeah, I also met Arnold at IHES in the spring of '74 when I heard Cassin's lectures. And so then I got back to Berkeley, and Arnold Cassin had already left, but I talked to Jack Wagner about he knew this stuff because of his work with Hatcher Wagner on pseudoisotopies. So I learned some stuff about surf theory from Jack Wagner, and eventually found a proof. And so I knew the proof by fall of '74, and I taught a course in four manifolds in fall '74 where Bott was visiting. He came, corrected some of my errors. But then, you know, things moved slower back then. I didn't write it up and submit a paper till early '76. And I sent it to the Annals, and they, I think it's the only time I've had a paper rejected was, and that's because I was an associate editor of the Annals, and somebody else had submitted a paper that was in the same ballpark, but I don't know what was in it. But anyway, he felt it would be inappropriate for an associate editor to get a paper accepted by the Annals when they turned down a paper by somebody who wasn't an associate editor. So I sent it to Inventiones. And I think Alan Hatcher was the referee and found a mistake, and had to do with three handles. And it took me a week or two to correct it and sort it out, and then it finally appeared in '78. I called it a calculus for framed links in S3. And I like this because it was a uniqueness theorem. You see, back in 1961, I think, Raymond Lickers had proved that every three manifold could be obtained by surgeries on a link in the three-sphere. And this is the same thing as what I was doing. And so that was an existence theorem. Every three manifold could be obtained by surgery. And now mine was a uniqueness theorem, that if you had two different ways to obtain the three manifold by surgery, you could get from one to the other by two moves. So the question was there any application of this theorem? And there wasn't until topological quantum field theory came along, and people like Reshetkin and Trayev would take a handle diagram and they would do some algebra with it and get an invariant of that diagram, and then they had to show, well, suppose you change it to another one describing the same three manifold. Well, I gave moves, so then they had to show their invariant was an invariant didn't change under those moves. That was the first application. But it had an application of a philosophical nature. It said that if you could construct three manifolds a certain way, well then, or if you had two pictures of three manifold, if they were the same, you had to be able to find these moves between them. And so it's kind of and it was a language. I mean, you for a while used these pictures, handle body pictures, frame length pictures in your work, and so did other people. And my students took it up, like Selman, Akbulut, and it became known as the Kirby calculus because of my friends.
We've both been sort of idiosyncratic mathematicians, I think. I mean, there's some value there, which is maybe a sort of a takeaway message in terms of the educational process, because it's not enough to have all the best students become mathematicians. You need, some sort of oddball characters to get in there as well, right?
Chern used to say that it's perfectly okay to get your first job off in some provincial university and stay away from listening to everybody else and do your own work, which is what he did. When he got his PhD in Germany, he then had a job, because of the unrest in China, he was in the far western part and cut off from everybody. And that's where he did his great work. When I got my PhD, I wanted to go to the Institute for Advanced Study. But if I'd gone there, I would have felt obliged to listen to Borel and all the great people there, and I wouldn't have listened to them much because it wasn't my way, and I probably wouldn't have been good for me. Instead, I went to UCLA. There was no topologists in Southern California in 1965, except for a couple of young guys they had just hired, Dave Gilman and Bob Brown and so on. And so we ran seminars together, and it was, we talked to each other, and that was a good environment for me, whereas I don't know that the Institute would have been. Although when I did go there and found Larry Siebenmann, it worked perfectly.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your student Selman Akbulut and maybe some of your other students, because I think you've had 53 students. It's kind of an amazing career.
I was thinking of Selman Akbulut because of something funny he said once. Not to me, I heard this secondhand. But he came to Berkeley as an undergraduate in '67 and took courses, at least one course from Dennis Sullivan. So he knew who Dennis Sullivan was. And then I arrived there in January '72, and I think right off he joined one of my courses. And it's reported that he said to one of his fellow students that it was really a relief to meet Rob Kirby, because now I know you can be slow and still be a good mathematician. It was terrible under Dennis Sullivan, because how do you're a student, how did you ever manage to, with Dennis Sullivan, if you have to be Dennis Sullivan to be great, that's a problem. I've had a great time with my 53 students. They're more like, well, it's an extension of the way I was a father to my son and daughter. I expected them to be independent and didn't advise them a lot, didn't tell them a lot what to do. So I was not the kind of advisor which took a lot of responsibility. I mean, I'd have 10 students at one time, and people would say, how can you do that? Well, the reason was that I wasn't giving them problems and telling them what to do and sort of doing part of the work for them. My students were all very independent, and what I set up, well, partly I was the only geometric topologist at Berkeley, but I got an early start because we had a lot of students looking for advisors in the '70s. And they were a good bunch. We ran seminars together, so I had a hand in creating an environment where they talked to each other a lot, which I thought was the right way to do things. And I would encourage them and suggest subjects. I would certainly suggest subjects, give some courses, get some visitors there so that there's an interesting environment.
Did you run a seminar with them?
Oh yeah, I always ran a seminar.
So the students, one of your students would speak every week or more often?
Yes, at least that, right. And so, the first strong group at Berkeley included Marty Charlemagne, who's here, and Michael Handel, and Selman Akbulut, and Paul Melvin, John Hara, and then they taught younger ones, and there was another next group of Joel Haas and Danny Ruberman and Tim Cochran and Bob Gompf, and I'm forgetting people. In fact, I'm going to stop doing this because I'm going to forget somebody. I'll be embarrassed that I left them out. So this worked really well, I would say, this leaving them to find their own problems. This was a time in those days in low-dimensional topology where you essentially could be expected to have an overview of the whole subject and know what there was to know about surfaces in 3 manifolds and 4 manifolds. You could really expect a student to at least know about what was going on. You didn't have to have a lot of background to get at the problem, so they could find their own, decide what they wanted to work in. And I encouraged them to do that, and I thought I was a great advisor for doing that. And then along comes Thurston in the late 70s, and then you, and then Simon Donaldson in gauge theory. And by the 80s, I realized that if you were a student wanting to work in gauge theory, you really needed a fair amount of advice and guidance. You know, how much analysis do you have to learn? How much differential geometry? How much topology do you have to know? I mean, there's the famous story about Simon Donaldson himself, who thought he had shown that there were no positive definite intersection forms, but instead what he had shown was there was no smooth 4 manifolds with those forms. But he didn't know that much about that algebra. Students needed some guidance. You know, now these subjects were blooming. By the time gauge theory came along, I figure you were lucky if you had a fair grasp of 1/4 of geometric topology. So if I sent students out into geometric topology to find your own problems, they were likely to get a problem that I couldn't help them on. So Tom Rufka helped me out with a bunch of students in gauge theory. And then other people have done the same thing. Peter Ojvad helped out with several students who got interested in Ojvad-Szabo Hagar-Floor homology. And I couldn't help them as well as Peter O could. So times changed. And I was a good advisor at one time and then a not so great advisor in later years. But certainly I really enjoyed having these students. One of my later students is David Gay, whom I'm collaborating with right now. Almost all of my collaborators, except Larry Siebenmann and you, have been my graduate students, and that's really been enjoyable. So I said problems once. That reminds me of the problem list. So I edited a problem list in 1976. It grew out of a conference at Stanford. And so I edited this problem list, and I really enjoyed it. I was just an editor. You know, a lot of people, I would say, what's a good problem in your field? And then they'd tell me something, I'd write it down, and they'd say, I'd ask them to write it better. And so I was just an editor, really. But for a long time, I'd refer to this problem list as my memory, because there was more written down there so I did that in '76. That list became kind of famous, and it led to my getting the National Academy of Sciences prize in reviewing, scientific reviewing. So they do that every year for a review paper. Well, they'd never done one in math. And when the mathematicians were asked, they couldn't quite figure out what a review paper meant in mathematics. So they decided that my problem list was I think Singer was the one who decided that was a good example. So I got a prize for that problem list. And then I wrote a much more extensive one. It was a vastly bigger job and required the internet and email to do it. I finished that in '94 or '95, and then that was that. Somehow the time has passed for those. You know, if somebody was going to upgrade that, it would take about 5 people to do because so much has happened. But the problem lists were fun. They were helpful to students.
Related to math, but slightly tangential, I know you've put a lot of energy in the last 10 years thinking and working on creation of journals and open access issues. And this is a very important issue in mathematics. I think it's even more important issue in medicine, where people's lives actually depend on the information in a timely fashion. It's certainly an important issue in chemistry, physics. But you're a person with real experience in open access issues. So can I get you to talk a little bit about your involvement in this and what the numbers are like? How much would it really cost to solve this problem?
So numbers aren't very well understood by the general public. So maybe it's always easiest to start historically. So back in '96, in some idle moment, I looked at a few journals in the MSRI library and noticed how much they cost per page. And I was sort of struck by the wide variance in the cost from the commercial journals down to, say, the Annals of Mathematics. I then did a survey and published it on my website, a list of, 50 or 100 journals and what they cost per page. A journal subscription isn't the right number because some journals have 10,000 pages per year and some have 500. If you typed in Kirby into Google, you got me first because of all the libraries which linked to this little article I wrote up. It wasn't published, it was just linked just on my website. And the reason for that was that the American Physical Society, I think that's the ones, had done a similar thing about 10 years earlier. And then the American Math Society had a version of it also where they listed the cost of journals per page. And Gordon and Breach, they were two crusty old English gentlemen who were just ticked off at this, and they sued. And you wouldn't think there's anything to sue about, but they sued that this was an unfair tabulation of prices because it did not take quality into account. And this would go normally nowhere in the US, but it actually has some legs in Europe. And so everybody dropped the issue till the suit was settled. Well, it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court in the US. And Bus Jaco, when he was executive director of the AMS, I don't think he testified before the Supreme Court, but he had a hand in the case. And anyway, Gordon and Breach completely lost, but for 10 years nothing had been done. And so then when mine appeared, it was the only one out there. And of course my reaction was, sue me, that would be great publicity, but they didn't. So that got me started, and then that also got Colin Rourke at Warwick and a couple other people to think of starting a journal, which became Geometry and Topology. And so we just started a journal, and a naive couple of kids in a just say, well, let's start a journal. So we did, but it's grown into a really excellent journal because the topology community really got behind us. I mean, Mike served on the journal from the beginning, and a whole bunch of people did, and we got good papers, and the journal thrived, and we spun off a sister journal, and then in the middle of 2005, 6, 7, we started up a journal in algebra and number theory, another one in analysis and PDE, another one in computational science and applied mathematics, the other way around, and an undergraduate math journal. And then we also started, eventually we had to have some legal standing, so we started a company called Mathematical Sciences Publishers. Poor name, but we didn't think of a better one, so it's just MSP is how you remember it. And that got started, and those journals have thrived mathematically. It's been very hard to get subscriptions in the current climate, and so we're only in the black. We started in '04, and now we're in the black this year. It's hard to tell what the commercial journals cost because of bundling, which obscures the prices. But sometime several years ago, I computed, and some commercial journals have an income in the order of nearly $1,000 a page. That income comes from the subscription price times the number of subscribers divided by the number of pages. It's just a simple calculation. So some of them were up $1,000. One time Inventiones Mathematica was at $600 a page. The AMS journals, they're low cost, they're not commercial. They get an income of around $200 to $250 a page. Annals is about $100 a page. We survive on about $30 a page, partly because we're housed at a university, partly because we've been forced to be very thrifty and efficient. So then, with those numbers in mind, the question is, suppose you wanted to start, your question was, suppose you wanted to start a journal that was open access, so free to the world, so there are no subscriptions. So how do you get, let's say, $50 a page income? Well, one thing you could do is have page charges, where the page charges are paid by your library. So every time your library, a faculty member at this school, submits a paper and gets page charges, it takes it to the library pays it, and whatever they pay, they break even by cutting a journal of that amount. So there's a gradual transition to where they pay page charges and they don't subscribe. And the libraries will save a huge amount of money because they're paying $50 a page, say, and these other things are are way higher than that. The libraries around the world will pay up, hundreds of dollars per page. So there's a lot of efficiency, but the trouble is it's very hard to get people to change to page charges. So Mike, an alternative way to fund math journals would be to have an endowment and have them open access and no page charges, no subscriptions, no nothing. So you could guess that maybe it takes $50 per page to run such a journal with good copy editing and all the stuff that goes into a journal. No print, just electronic. And so then if it's $50 a page, and let's suppose that we wanted to endow the best 200 math journals. There's over 700, but let's suppose we want to do the 200 best. And let's say they average about 2,000 pages per year each one. So this then is a total of $20 million you need per year to run this. And then assuming 5% rate of return, if you had a $400 million endowment, that would take care of mathematics. That would make everything open access, and libraries' budgets would disappear, and everybody would have access around the world, and so on. That's a nice solution for $400 million.
And suppose you wanted to solve the problem for all of science and medicine, what would you think?
Well, I suspect you have to multiply by more than 10, by
20.
Maybe by 20 or something like that. So instead of 400 million, maybe you need 10 billion, something like that. And that would just solve the problem of publishing. And so that's one way to go. But of course, 10 billion, a billion here, a billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money.
Yeah.
So the publishing stuff I've done is interesting. Right now, at this very moment, Tim Gowers had a blog about the high cost of journals in Elsevier, which they focused on Elsevier, and there's been a lot of people signing petitions and so on, and so there's concern among, well, it seems like it's a lot of people, but actually it's a small fraction of mathematicians and a smaller yet fraction of scientists. But there's movement towards solving the journal problem.
I think mathematics, because it's relatively small, is maybe an interesting place to try to solve the problem first. I would think medicine, if a person's cancer treatment depends on a paper that their local library can't afford to have access to, that's rather a tragedy if you're getting the wrong chemotherapy because of research that was funded by the NIH is not available to you as an American citizen because it's locked up in a journal that your library can't afford to subscribe to. That's a rather terrible circumstance.
Right. And math is easier because we use tech, and that makes the job much easier. And we have the archive, and of course, we want papers to last a long time. I mean, we read papers that are 20 years old, or papers which are 31 years old, like yours. Whereas, in the sciences, if it's a couple of years old, it's old.
Did you want to say anything about your recent research? Morse functions with David Gay?
For the last 8-9 years, David Gay and I have been involved in trying to understand four manifolds that don't necessarily have symplectic forms. So with the gauge theory and with all of that work, it always involves a symplectic form to show that certain moduli spaces are compact. And if they're zero-dimensional, you can count solutions and get an invariant. So to go beyond symplectic manifolds, Taubes and Honda, I think, had the first ideas where they talked about near symplectic forms, which were symplectic forms that they were closed two forms which vanished, which were symplectic forms away from a one-dimensional manifold, and then they vanished identically in that one-dimensional manifold. And so then Dave and I constructed such forms, constructed the manifolds and the forms on them, sort of constructed them, and then this led to another paper from Simon Donaldson and Daniel Roux and Katsarkov, where they looked at four manifolds which were they call them broken fibrations over the two-sphere. So they were generalizations of Lefschetz fibrations. Only there were circles in there where they were singular, so they were broken. The fibers A fiber would have been a surface, but then there would be the circle, and when you pass the circle, the fiber would go up or down in genus by 1. So the fibers were broken in the sense that they changed genus. And so then David and I constructed those, and then we began to realize that what we should be doing is looking at not Morse functions, which go back to the 30s, which are maps, generic maps from a manifold to the real numbers, but maps to a two-dimensional surface, typically a ball or the plane or the two-sphere. But then you look at such maps, and again, they have to have this broken feature. The fibers have to change genus as you do it. But we showed that such nice maps to the two-sphere exist for all 4 manifolds, including homotopy 4 spheres, which are particularly interesting. See, the near symplectic forms, that was a closed 2 form, which meant there had to be second cohomology. So that ruled out homotopy 4 spheres. But our constructions don't need that. So we have maps from a homotopy 4 sphere, for example, down to the 2 sphere, and they have nice features. So these maps exist with just these circles of singularities. And then we then proved a uniqueness theorem about how, if you have 2 such maps, how do they relate? And what this is all sort of going back to is sort of surf theory, the kind of surf theory that's used by Hatcher and Wagoner to prove their theorem about pseudoisotopies. And ours is more general than that, but it involves really 1-parameter families of Morse functions. So it's sort of upping Morse theory by an extra dimension. And you can think of this also as the best analogs of complex the left set's vibrations. So it's the complex world, which is so much richer than the real world, but it's an analog of that. And our goal, you always have to have a dream, that's to show that the smooth 4-dimensional Poincare conjecture is false by understanding what these Morse functions do and somehow getting an invariant out of them. We call them 2 Morse functions because they're mapped to something 2-dimensional rather than just Morse functions.
Well, good luck with that program.
Right? Yeah, well, we'll need some luck. But as you said once, when you get to be my age, you want to grab a hold of some smart young fellow and hang on to their coattails. I haven't mentioned my collaborations with Paul Melvin. He was visiting Stanford in 1989, and Reshetikhin came by and gave one lecture about his work with Turayev, the Reshetikhin Turayev invariants. And we listened to it and thought to ourselves, well, we should see what these are topologically, because this was just kind of a very algebraic thing. And so we set out on that, and it had a nice collaboration for several years on this topic. He likes algebra more than I do, and I would say he's the driving force. He's very careful, and so we wrote a paper on this that I think has no mistakes in it, believe it or not.
I've used the paper.
But anyway, Paul Melvin has been one of my favorite collaborators. Also Selman Akbulut, who we wrote several papers together, and he's an absolute marvel with the Kirby calculus. He's proven, he's the world's master at it. Bob Gompf knows it very well, yeah. But so do few others, but he's the master at it, proving that there have been conjectural 4 manifolds which are conjectured to be distinct from something well known, and he ends up by a long process of showing their equivalent. People in 4 manifolds are always trying to find the smallest, simply connected manifold with an exotic structure on it. Well, if you're willing to take relative cases of manifold with boundary, then he did this first in 1988, I think.
The Maser manifold, right?
Right, showing that there's a contractible 4 manifold. So the bounding 3 manifold has only 1 smooth structure, but given that, it has 2 smooth structures inside. In other words, there's no diffeomorphism from one to the other, which is the identity of the boundary.
Actually, if I can just interrupt for a second, that's the example of the light-like vector that I was referring to. If you call one of those smooth structures A and the other B, then it's A minus B, that if you pair it with itself, you get 0. You get 0, yeah. But that would represent positivity failing in 4 dimensions.
Right,
yeah.
Right, it's that example, yeah. So Selman has really, he did that proof by a great number of diagrams that he can draw like nobody else.
So Rob, this celebration of mathematics, Celebratio Mathematica, I know I have a page in it, but I haven't looked at it yet. Can you tell me what it is?
This was an idea a year and a half ago or more of Jim Pittman, who's in the stat department. He's a probabilist at Berkeley. And he said something, and I thought that's a great idea. And what it is that the commercial publishers are publishing very few collected works anymore because libraries can't afford to buy them. And so they're doing very little of this. There's one this year of Milnor, and there's still a couple, but not very many. And so the idea was to do a digital version of this, an electronic version. So we call it Celebratio Mathematica. It's celebratio.org is the URL. And what it consists of is each person, there's a person, and they have a volume, which is a collected works. And a volume consists of a biography, perhaps an autobiography, one or the other, a complete bibliography, CV, of course, a list of their students, interesting photographs from all ages. We have a nice photograph of Michael Atiyah at 2 years, dressed as the abbot. They call him the abbot in this little picture. So nice photos. Of course, we have photos of Mike climbing. And then maybe most important is commentaries on the mathematical work. Well, tributes about the person, but in particular commentaries on the mathematical work, which are somewhat hard to get, but when you get them, why, this is a chance to give a review many years later of a piece of work, how it started, what was behind it, and then what developments there were later on. I mean, that would be a rather extensive commentary, but they could be short or long. And so it's really collected works for the digital age is a phrase for Celebratio Mathematica. We have volumes for Atiyah and Mike. There's some others which are in various stages. There's one for Emmy Nutter, and there's one for R.L. Moore because of his descendants. I'm one of his grandsons. And then there's the idea that a university, a math department, can have its own collection, and there'll be a front web page for that. So there's a picture of Eckert Hall for the University of Chicago. We started out there with E.H. Moore and Dixon and Albert and Kaplansky, Saunders, McLean, Stone, and we're working on to the rest of them, trying to get the highlights of the University of Chicago's mathematical history. And so that can be done for other departments as well. So that's another aspect of it. This thing costs money. It does cost something to get this run. The software has cost us over $50,000 to design, and so we rely on donations. If you think of the math genealogy website, which is a great website to have now. Well, all the information in there was in math departments had lists of their students somewhere, if you could find them. But they weren't in any one place, and nobody ever looked up students much because you couldn't find them. But now that we have the genealogy site, lots of reasons to go look up whose student was who and check on history, and it's all in one place. Well, that's what we all want to do with Celebratio Mathematica, is to get lots of this in one place where there's a spot where you start first to see what's written about a given person. I mean, Wikipedia has theirs, but they're short. There's a nice website in Scotland, St. Andrews, but they have shorter amounts of material on people. They have a lot of people, but only shorter amounts. And so we would like this to be an analog of the genealogy site where you can find out lots of material. Students can look at it and see what these people were like in the past. And anyway, I'm enjoying it.
Rob, you spent a lot of time describing your idiosyncratic approach to your own education and then the education of your graduate students, which actually had a lot in common with my own tactic, which was opportunistic, just to learn as much from my graduate students as I could and let them take care of their own thesis writing. But is this realistic going forward, or has mathematics started to become so complicated that graduate students really need guidance to get through a thesis?
Well, I'll start back when I was first aware of these things, when students got their PhDs in 3 years. And they'd come, they'd take a year of graduate courses and prepare for the qualifying exam the beginning of their second year, and then their advisor would give them a problem and sort of tell them what to do and so on, and they'd then spend some time and finish up in their third year. And what I was told by someone was that 75% of PhDs never wrote another paper beyond their thesis, and it seemed to me that the reason for this was they had not really done research yet, because a big part of research is finding your own problems. And if the advisor hands you the problem and tells you what techniques are needed, that didn't always happen. But then you haven't had all the experience of finding your own problems, which is important. So then I always took the tactic that my students should spend an extra year or so finding their problems, because then if they do that, they've made some wrong choices and they know what doesn't work, and that's important. They've tried different things and maybe one of them works out, but then a couple others are just are part way along, and they can easily transition to that when they get their next job. So my philosophy was, this is the early 70s, was that students should find their own problems, and if it took an extra year, fine. Because when you got your PhD, then, in those days, you got a 2-year postdoc, and so about 18 months later, you were having to apply for jobs already. And whereas if you'd taken an extra year and had some more mathematics that's kind of in the oven waiting to go, you still, then in that 18 months, you'd look a lot better. And somehow the community did not subtract that extra year of graduate school when they looked at your record. They wanted to know, what had you done after your advisor let you go? And if you had that extra year as a graduate student learning stuff and getting stuff part way done, you were that much better off. So I used to encourage them to take an extra year.
But haven't things progressed way beyond that? I mean, now some of the best people coming out with PhDs have 8 archive postings, maybe 10.
Those are rare. Well, there was a year in the late 70s at Berkeley when we had 40 PhDs, and 10 took 4 years, 10 took 5, 10 took 6, and 10 took more than 6 years. So already it was beyond 3. And now I think 5-year PhD is, well, of course there's some who do it very fast, but 5 years and 6 years is very typical, because there's a lot more math to learn. If you're going into a subject, there's just more to absorb.
But isn't it true that a typical graduating PhD from Berkeley has at least one other publication?
The good ones, yes. Yeah. So Marty Charlemagne, my first student at Berkeley, had five papers. They weren't all published, but he had 5 when he finished. And so many of my students had more than one. In the old days, I used to tell you to write up lots of background material. The thesis was partly a work of scholarship. So you spent time with background stuff as well. And then when you finished, you had to go spend time revising it for a journal. And so now I think we all basically say, write some papers and we'll staple them together and put a cover page on it for your thesis, which is much more efficient for the student. They don't do scholarship anymore, but it's much more efficient. And then again, because maybe subjects were more isolated back in those days. If you were doing topology, you had to know some algebraic topology, but you didn't have to know any differential geometry or analysis, at least for lots of topologists. Whereas now there's subjects that intermix, and you just have to learn more. And that's why I was saying earlier, students need more advice, at least guidance. Not in the sense of giving somebody a problem, but helping them get to a place where they can realistically find a doable problem on their own. So I think the world has changed in that way.